She was thrown out in the dead of winter. No coat, no money, a newborn baby pressed against her chest. The temperature was dropping fast, and the men who called themselves her family stood at the door and watched her go without a single word of apology. They thought the cold would finish what they started. They were wrong. This is the story of Elena Cross, a woman the frontier tried to erase. Stay with me until the end, because what she builds from nothing will leave you breathless. If stories like this speak to you, hit that subscribe button and become part of our family. You won't want to miss what's coming next. Drop a like and tell me in the comments, what city or country are you watching from? I want to see exactly how far Elena's story travels. The night they put Elena out, it was already past 11. She knew because she had been watching the clock on the mantle, the one her mother had brought across 3 states in a wagon, counting the minutes the way you count things when you're terrified and trying to keep your mind attached to something solid. Outside, the wind was doing what wind does in Wyoming in late November. It wasn't just blowing, it was hunting. It found every gap in the boards, every loose window latch, every crack under a door that hadn't been properly fitted since the summer. She had the baby wrapped in the blue flannel blanket she'd sewn herself during the 7th month. When her hands were swollen and her back ached so badly she had to stop every 10 minutes and press her knuckles into the base of her spine. The stitching wasn't perfect. Nothing about Elena Cross had ever been perfect, and she had long since stopped pretending otherwise. Her father stood in the doorway of the main house. Raymond Cross was 61 years old, broad through the shoulders, with a gray beard he kept trimmed short, and eyes the color of creek water in February, pale and carrying no warmth whatsoever. He had not always been a cold man. Elena remembered a version of him from her childhood that laughed at dinner and let her ride on his back through the yard. But that man had been disappearing for years, ground down by debt and pride in equal measure, until what was left was something harder and less forgiving than the land he farmed. "You made your choice," he said. "You live with it. Papa, I told you what would happen." He wasn't raising his voice. That was somehow worse. A yelling man could be reasoned with, bargained down. A man speaking in that flat, finished tone had already closed every door in his mind. "I told you a year ago, didn't I tell you?" Elena shifted the baby higher on her chest. The infant was asleep, which felt like a small grace, though grace had been in short supply lately. Her daughter was 11 days old. 11 days. She still didn't have a name, not a real one. Elena had been calling her little one in the dark hours, whispering it against the soft, warm smell of her head. "Where am I supposed to go?" Elena asked. She hated how her voice sounded. Thin, ragged at the edges. She had promised herself she wouldn't beg. She was keeping most of that promise. "That is not my concern anymore." Her stepbrother Dale was standing just behind their father, arms crossed, eyes on the ground. He was 24 and had been working the Cross Ranch since he was 14. He was not a cruel person by nature. Elena had always understood that about him. He was simply a person who had never developed the habit of standing up for anything that cost him something. He said nothing. He would say nothing. That was who Dale Cross was, and Elena accepted it the way you accept weather. Her stepmother Vera had already gone to bed. That, Elena thought, told you everything you needed to know about Vera. She picked up the satchel from the porch steps. It was brown leather, cracked along the handle, stuffed with what she'd been able to gather in the 40 minutes between Raymond's pronouncement and this moment. 2 changes of clothes for herself, 4 flannel squares for the baby, a small tin of salve, a box of matches, half a loaf of bread wrapped in cloth, a jar of dried beans, her mother's silver thimble, which had no practical value whatsoever but which she could not leave behind, and $12.30 she'd kept in the lining of her winter coat since August, money she'd earned doing mending work for Mrs. Hadley in town. Raymond didn't know about that money. Elena was grateful now for the small deceptions that self-preservation had required. She didn't say goodbye. There was nothing left to say that wouldn't cost her the composure she needed. She walked off the porch and into the dark. The temperature was somewhere south of 15 degrees. She knew the land well enough to move through it even without a lantern. The Cross Ranch sat on the eastern slope of a valley she'd walked her whole life, and her feet remembered the ground the way feet do when they've crossed the same terrain for 23 years. She kept to the tree line, which cut the wind some, and she kept moving because stopping was not an option. The baby stirred once, made a small sound that could have been the beginning of a cry or could have been a dream, and then settled again. That's right, Elena thought. You sleep. Let me handle this part. She had a direction in mind, though she wouldn't have called it a plan. About 4 miles northeast, up into the rougher country where the valley floor gave way to broken ridgeline and old timber, there was a cabin. It had belonged to a trapper named Hollis, who had worked the area for decades before his knees gave out, and he'd moved to live with relatives somewhere in Montana. Elena had been in it twice, both times as a girl, both times with her real mother before the fever took her. She remembered it as small and dark and smelling of pine resin and old smoke. She had no idea what state it was in now, whether the roof still held, whether the door still latched, whether anything about it was still standing at all. But it was the only shelter she could think of that no one would look for her in. She walked for 2 hours. The cold got into her boots somewhere around the second mile, working through the leather and the wool socks and settling into her toes with a patience that frightened her. She switched the baby from arm to arm to keep her circulation moving. The wind picked up as she climbed, coming off the higher ridges with a meanness that felt almost deliberate. She stopped twice to check that the baby was breathing, putting her face down close, feeling the small, steady warmth of her daughter's exhaled breath against her cheek. Still here? Keep moving. The cabin materialized out of the darkness like something half-remembered from a fever dream. Dark timber walls, a slumping roofline on one side, a door that had swollen in its frame and taken a certain violence to open. Elena put her shoulder into it twice before it gave. Inside, darkness, cold that was somehow drier than outside, the smell of old wood and something animal she didn't want to identify, and the beautiful catastrophic relief of being out of the wind. She stood in the doorway for a moment, breathing hard. Then she went to work. There was a fireplace in the far wall, and whoever had maintained the cabin last had, by some small miracle, left a half stack of split wood against the interior wall. It was old and possibly damp, and Elena didn't care. She laid the baby on the floor, on the satchel, which she opened flat to keep her off the bare wood, and started building a fire the way her mother had taught her. Small stuff first, tinder, then kindling, then the larger pieces once you had something worth feeding. It took 4 matches. The 4th one caught, and Elena watched the flame take hold of the bark curls with something that felt embarrassingly close to love. She got the fire going. She got it big enough to produce actual heat. She wrapped the baby tighter and held her close to the warmth and sat on the floor with her back against the stone base of the fireplace. And finally, for the first time since Raymond had opened his mouth that morning, she let herself think about what had actually happened. The baby's father was a man named Thomas Reeves. Thomas Reeves was 28, good-looking in a way that had clearly caused him problems his entire life, and completely unwilling to acknowledge that the child Elena carried was his. He had said as much in front of witnesses, in front of Elena's father, which was what had lit the fuse on Raymond's patience. And then he had left for Colorado with a freighting company and had not been heard from since. Elena did not know if she hated him. She'd spent a lot of the pregnancy trying to locate that feeling and finding instead something flatter and more exhausting, a kind of bottomless disappointment, not just in Thomas, but in herself, for having believed that a man like that was something other than what he was. She hadn't loved him. She'd wanted to, which was worse. The fire popped and spat a small ember onto the stone. Elena watched it die. Okay, she told herself, stop. This is not the night for that. She did a slow survey of what she had. $12.30, half a loaf of bread and a jar of dried beans, a box of matches, now with 4 fewer inside. A baby who needed to eat, which meant Elena needed to eat, which was a problem she would have to address in the morning light when she could actually see. The roof, she noticed, was leaking in one corner. Not water yet, but the boards were warped in a way that suggested rain or snow would come through eventually. One wall had a gap near the base where the chinking had fallen out, letting in a thin tongue of cold air that she stuffed with a piece of her spare blouse before she even registered the decision to do it. The door wouldn't latch. She wedged a piece of firewood under the handle. She took inventory of the cabin with the methodical calm of someone who has decided, quietly and without ceremony, that panic is a luxury they cannot currently afford. It was small, 1 room, maybe 14 by 16 feet. A rough wooden shelf along one wall with nothing on it. A sleeping platform built into the far corner. No mattress, just bare boards. A table with one leg shorter than the others, which someone had corrected with a folded piece of leather underneath. A coffee tin on the shelf, which she opened and found empty. The fireplace worked. That was the main thing. As long as she had wood, she had heat, and as long as she had heat, she and her daughter were not going to freeze. That was enough to build on. Elena nursed the baby in the firelight, watching the flames with the particular kind of exhausted alertness that new mothers know. Too tired to do anything, too wired to sleep, the mind cycling through lists of problems the way water cycles through a wheel. The baby nursed well. That too was something. "You don't have a name yet," Elena said quietly, not really to herself and not really to the baby, but somewhere in between. "I kept waiting until things settled down. That was probably stupid of me." The baby's eyes were closed. She had her mother's hairline, a widow's peak already visible on that small, round forehead, and fists she kept tightly clenched, as if even at 11 days old she was braced for something. "I'll think of one," Elena said. "Give me a few days." Morning came gray and brutal. The temperature had dropped further overnight. She didn't know exactly how far, but the water in her canteen had developed a skim of ice, which told her enough. The fire had burned down to coals that she nursed back to life, with the careful attention of someone who understood she could not afford to let it go out completely. She assessed the wood supply. Maybe 2 days at the rate she was burning. After that, she would need to find more. She had eaten one piece of bread the night before. She ate another one now, slowly, chewing each bite longer than necessary, the way her mother had taught her to do when food was uncertain, the beans she would boil when she had the energy to deal with it. Outside, the world was white and silent and enormous. She stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at it. The valley was invisible from here. The terrain had folded around the cabin and cut it off from the lowland, which was part of why Hollis had built here, she supposed. Privacy. Isolation. The qualities that had made it useless to anyone else were exactly what made it valuable to her right now. No one would come looking, not her father certainly, not Dale, not anyone from town who might feel some neighborly obligation. The frontier was full of people who minded their own business, and whatever business Elena Cross was in, she was in it alone. She breathed in the cold air, which was clean and sharp and indifferent. "Fine," she thought. "Then I handle it myself." She went back inside and looked at the walls of the cabin, really looked at them, the way a person looks at something they're going to have to fix rather than something they're allowed to simply observe. The gap near the base, the warped roof boards, the door that wouldn't latch, the single-leg wobble on the table, the sleeping platform that needed something between her body and the bare wood, or she would wake up stiff and useless. There were, she noticed, a few old tools hanging on the wall near the door. A hammer, a hand saw, a coil of wire that had seen better days, a hatchet with a handle that was cracked but not yet broken. Elena Cross was not a carpenter. She had never claimed to be. She had sewn her own clothes, kept her mother's kitchen garden, done the accounts for the ranch from the time she was 16. Her father's arithmetic had always been creative in ways that got him into trouble. And she had done enough general maintenance on the ranch buildings to understand the basic principles of keeping weather out of places it didn't belong. She took the hammer off the wall. "Start somewhere," she told herself. "You can't fix everything today. Fix one thing." She fixed the gap in the wall first. More strips of fabric from her spare blouse packed tight into the chinking, which wouldn't hold forever, but would hold long enough for her to find something better. Then she worked on the door latch, which required more creativity than she had tools for, but she eventually rigged a drop bar from a piece of wood she found in the corner and a bent nail. She straightened against the stone edge of the fireplace. By midday, the baby was awake and demanding, and Elena sat down to nurse her and realized that her hands were shaking, not from cold, though the cold was certainly contributing, but from low blood supply, from not having eaten enough, from the accumulated weight of the last 12 hours pressing down on a body that had only been done with childbirth for 11 days. "We need a plan," she said to her daughter, who was eating with single-minded intensity and clearly not interested in planning. "We need more food," Elena continued, keeping her voice level, the way you talk to yourself when talking to yourself is the only option. "We need more wood. We need to know what's within walking distance of here. And we need to do all of that without, she exhaled, without getting both of us killed. So, small steps. The baby pulled back from nursing and looked up at her. She had dark eyes, very dark, not the vague blue of most newborns. They focused on Elena's face with a steadiness that didn't seem entirely appropriate for an 11-day-old person, and something about that steadiness reached into Elena's chest and grabbed hold of something she hadn't known was still there. "Okay," Elena said quietly, "we're going to be fine." She wasn't sure she believed it yet, but she said it with enough conviction that it became, in that moment, something closer to a decision than a hope. Outside, the wind found the cabin walls and pressed against them, looking for a way in. It didn't find one. Not today. The second week was harder than the first. That surprised her, though it probably shouldn't have. The first week had run on adrenaline, the sharp, clarifying panic of immediate crisis, of having so many urgent problems that the mind didn't have room to register how bad things actually were. She'd fixed the wall gap, rigged the door, rationed the bread down to almost nothing, melted snow for water, and kept the fire alive through 3 nights that dropped well below zero. She had been so busy surviving that she hadn't had time to understand what surviving cost. The second week, she understood. Her body was the first problem. 11 days postpartum was not, it turned out, the ideal time to begin what amounted to frontier homesteading from scratch. She was bleeding still, less than before but enough to worry her, and the physical fatigue was a different animal than ordinary tiredness. It lived in her bones and didn't lift with sleep, partly because sleep came in fragments, broken every 2 to 3 hours by a baby who needed to eat and didn't care what time it was or how cold the cabin had gotten while the fire burned low. She named the baby on the 8th day in the cabin. She'd been turning names over in her mind the way you turn stones, looking at the underside, putting them back down if they didn't feel right. She'd considered her mother's name, Margaret, and then put it back because it felt too heavy, too much like a memorial. She'd considered simple names, practical names, names that wouldn't invite comment or confusion. In the end, she settled on Clara because it meant clear and bright, and because it seemed like a reasonable thing to hope for in a child whose first weeks of life had been conducted in semi-darkness and cold. "Clara," she said out loud, testing it. The baby was awake, lying on the sleeping platform on a makeshift pad Elena had constructed from her spare clothing and a piece of canvas she'd found rolled up in the corner of the cabin, left behind by Hollis, presumably, or someone before him. Clara looked at the ceiling with the unfocused concentration of the very young, her fists working slowly at nothing. "That's you," Elena said. "Clara Cross." She said the last name without thinking, and then sat with it for a moment. Cross. Her father's name. The name of the man who had put them both out in the cold. She considered changing it, then didn't. It was her name too, not just his, and she wasn't going to let Raymond take that from her on top of everything else. Clara Cross. It would do. The wood problem became acute at the end of the second week. She'd found a small stand of dead timber about a quarter mile from the cabin, pine that had died from beetle kill, still standing, dry enough to burn, and she'd been hauling it back in loads she could manage while carrying Clara in a sling she'd fashioned from the longer piece of canvas. The work was brutal. A quarter mile in knee-deep snow with 30 pounds of wood balanced against one side of her body and an infant against the other was not a thing she'd been trained for, and the first time she did it, she came back to the cabin shaking so badly she dropped half the load at the door and had to sit down on the floor and simply breathe for 10 minutes before she could stack it. The second time was slightly less terrible. The third time, her back stopped seizing up halfway through. That was how improvement worked out here. Not in leaps, not in revelations, but in the slow arithmetic of repetition making a slightly easier path in the snow where a harder one had been before. She boiled beans. She melted snow. She kept the fire going. She learned to split wood one-handed, with Clara in the sling, though she dropped the hatchet twice in the first session and said things out loud that she was glad no one was around to hear. She learned that the cabin's roof was weakest in the northwest corner, and when the snow got heavy enough to matter, she used the saw handle to clear it from inside by pushing up on the boards from below. A discovery she'd made by accident when a drip of snow melt landed directly on Clara's face in the middle of the night, and Elena had come awake with her heart hammering and every instinct firing at once. Clara had been fine. Annoyed, clearly, but fine. Elena had fixed the corner as best she could with more canvas and a piece of pine board she pried from the sleeping platform's outer edge, sacrificing the structural integrity of one end in exchange for keeping water off her daughter's face. She accepted this as a reasonable trade. The food ran out on day 19. Not completely. She still had a third of the beans left and about 4 days of careful rationing if she was smart about it. But the bread was gone. The small bit of salt pork she'd found in a tin under the shelf was gone, and she had eaten through every cushion of reserve she'd given herself. She needed to get to town. That meant a 4-mile walk each direction in conditions that had not improved, through terrain she knew well enough, but that had no mercy for a woman traveling alone with an infant in February. She went back and forth on it for 2 days. The careful, stubborn debate of someone who has learned that impulsive decisions in cold weather carry consequences that can't be undone. On the 3rd day, she put Clara in the sling, packed the satchel with the $12 and change, and the coffee tin she'd cleaned out and was using as a carrying vessel, and walked out the door before she could talk herself out of it again. Hatchet Creek was not a large town. It had a general store, a post office operating out of the back of the same building, a livery stable, 2 saloons, a barber shop, a doctor who was also the dentist, and a collection of residences that ranged from solid to barely standing, depending on how long the family had been there and how much of their money went to the saloons versus the hardware supplier. Elena had grown up coming here with her father for supplies and knew most faces, if not most names. She was aware, walking down the main street with Clara bundled against her chest and her satchel over one shoulder and her boots leaving wet prints on the boardwalk, that people were looking at her. Not staring. This was a frontier town, and its residents had the mannerly habit of looking away before you caught them looking, but aware of her in the way a town is aware of something that doesn't fit the expected picture. She went to the general store because she had to, and because she had decided beforehand exactly what she needed: dried beef, flour, salt, a small tin of lard, dried fruit if they had it and she could afford it. She had calculated the cost in her head 3 times during the walk down, adjusting and adjusting until she had a list that would keep her and Clara fed for roughly 3 weeks on $10. The man behind the counter was named Bert Calloway. He was in his 50s, wide through the middle, with the kind of face that had been cheerful for so long it had become its default setting regardless of what was actually happening behind it. "Miss Cross," he said. "Mr. Calloway." She set the list on the counter. She'd written it out on a scrap of paper with a pencil stub she'd found in the satchel pocket. "I need these things, please." He looked at the list. He looked at her. He looked at the bundle against her chest that was Clara, who had fallen asleep during the walk and was continuing that project undisturbed. "Your daddy know you're in town?" he asked. "My father's business and mine are separate," she said. She kept her voice level and her eyes on him. "I have money. I'd like to purchase those supplies." He was quiet for a moment in that particular way that meant he was making a decision about what kind of person he was going to be in the next 5 minutes. Elena waited him out. She had gotten good at waiting people out. "Price on flour's gone up since November," he said finally. $1.40 for a 20-pound bag. "That's fine." He filled the order without further comment. She paid in exact change and carried everything out in 2 trips to the boardwalk, where she repacked the satchel with the precision of someone who had thought about weight distribution for the 4-mile walk back. She was on her 2nd trip back to the counter when she heard his voice. "Caleb said he saw your light up on the ridge last week." This was a different voice, coming from the back of the store near the stove, where a few men had been sitting that she'd acknowledged but not engaged with. She turned. The speaker was a man she didn't recognize, younger than Bert, maybe 40, broad-shouldered, with a face that had spent serious time outdoors and bore the evidence. He wasn't being unkind. He was just stating a fact the way frontier men state facts, plainly, with the faint implication that facts should be self-explanatory. "That's likely," Elena said. "You up in the Hollis cabin?" "I am." A pause. "That roof's in bad shape on the north end." "I know. I've addressed it." Another pause, and she recognized this one as it was the pause of a man recalibrating, adjusting some internal estimate upward without quite being sure how to account for the adjustment. "Gideon Ashcroft," he said, not extending his hand. She was 6 feet away, and carrying a baby and a tin of lard, and he had the social awareness to recognize that a handshake wasn't practical. "I run the Ashcroft Ranch, East Valley." She knew the name. Most people in the territory knew it. Gideon Ashcroft had built his operation from a single claim 2 decades ago into one of the largest and most consistently solvent ranches in the region. He was spoken of the way competent people are spoken of on the frontier, without sentiment, with genuine respect, which was rare and worth more. "Elena Cross," she said, "Raymond's daughter." "His by blood," she said, "not by current arrangement." He nodded once. That was all. Just a nod. The particular kind that means I understand more than you said, and I'm not going to make you say the rest. It was, she thought, a decent quality in a person. She picked up her supplies and walked back out into the cold. Clara got sick on the 26th day. It started as a sound, a congestion in her breathing that hadn't been there before, a slight wheeze on the exhale that Elena noticed in the gray hours before dawn and filed immediately under problems that require action. By mid-morning, the baby was running a fever. Elena could feel it against her lips when she pressed them to Clara's forehead, and by afternoon, Clara was refusing to nurse properly, turning her head, crying with a hoarse, unhappy sound that was worse than ordinary crying because it had no energy behind it. Elena had dealt with sick animals on the ranch. She had dealt with her own illnesses, her mother's illnesses, the various misfortunes that fell on a family working hard land in hard weather. She knew the difference between sick but manageable and sick and getting worse, and by the end of that first night she understood that Clara was trending in the wrong direction. She sat by the fire and did not sleep and watched her daughter breathe. The breathing stayed labored, not critically, not the drowning sound she'd heard once in a neighbor's child years ago and never forgot, but wrong. Wrong enough. The fever didn't break by morning. Clara's eyes, when she was awake, had lost some of their characteristic steadiness and replaced it with a glazed, unhappy confusion that infants get when their bodies are working harder than they should have to. "Okay," Elena said, to herself, to the fire, to the situation. "Okay, think." She knew what she needed, medicine. Specifically, she needed the kind of things Dr. Pierce kept in his office in Hatchet Creek. Willow bark tincture at minimum, something to bring the fever down, ideally something for the congestion. She also needed to tell him what was happening so he could tell her if she was managing it right, or if she was missing something, he would see that she couldn't. That meant the walk, 4 miles, with a sick baby. In conditions that had not improved, if anything, the temperature had dropped further in the last 2 days, and there was a new wind coming off the higher peaks that found every gap between the canvas wrap and Clara's face, and worked at it with persistence. She packed what she needed. She made the fire as high as she dared. She'd be gone at minimum 4 hours, more likely 6, and the cabin would be cold when they got back, and she needed it not to be starting from nothing. She banked the coals carefully, stacked the larger pieces to catch slowly, and hoped. She put Clara in the sling over her heart and pulled her coat closed over both of them as far as it would go, which was not as far as she wanted. She wrapped the blue flannel blanket over that and tied it with a strip of canvas. It wasn't perfect. It was what she had. She opened the door and walked into the cold. Oh, the wind was worse than she'd expected. It came at her from the northwest in gusts that had genuine malice in them, cutting through her wool coat in a way that was more personal than weather had any right to be. She walked with her head down, watching her feet, counting steps the way she'd been taught to count things when conditions tried to overwhelm you. One thing, then the next, then the next. Don't look at the whole of it. Clara was quiet against her chest, which was either good, sleeping, or bad, too weak to protest. Elena kept one hand over the top of the bundle through her coat, feeling for warmth, feeling for the small rise and fall. The rise and fall was there. She walked. She was 2 miles out when the snow started. Not a storm, just the territory being its ordinary February self, shaking loose a curtain of gray-white from clouds that had been sitting fat and heavy over the ridge for the past day. But the snow reduced visibility and caught in the wind and made the trail she'd memorized from the previous trip harder to read, and she stopped once, completely, when she came to a section of ground that looked wrong. The terrain had shifted under drifts, and she wasn't sure she was on the right line. She stood very still. She breathed. She made herself look rather than panic. There was a bend in the tree line 30 yards ahead that she recognized, a cluster of 3 old aspens that stood together at an angle she'd noticed before. She oriented on that and kept moving. She got to town in 2.5 hours, which was longer than usual. Her feet were numb by the time she reached the boardwalk, and she stood for a moment outside the doctor's office, just breathing, getting the parts of her mind that the cold had started to scatter back into something organized. Dr. Pierce was in. He was a spare, precise man in his 60s who examined Clara with the same expression he probably applied to everything: thorough attention, no wasted emotion. He listened to her chest. He checked the fever. He asked Elena a series of questions about onset and symptoms in a tone that made her feel, for the first time in weeks, like a competent adult describing a situation rather than a woman on the edge of something bad. "Croup," he said, "early stage. You caught it right. What does she need?" "Steam first. You have a fire?" "Yes." "Keep water on it. The moisture helps. And this." He moved to his cabinet and began putting things together. "Eucalyptus oil in the water, not much, a few drops. Willow bark tincture for the fever. 2 drops in warm water, twice a day. Keep her warm, not hot. Don't overheat her trying to break the fever. And," he looked up, "she needs to eat. You need to eat. You look like you've lost 10 pounds since November." "I've been managing," Elena said. "You've been surviving," he said, not unkindly. "Those are different things." She paid him. It came to $1.70, which was less than she'd feared, and gathered the medicines and wrapped Clara back up for the return journey. Outside, she found that the snow had stopped and the wind had dropped marginally, which was the territory offering what passed for an apology. She was at the edge of town, just past the last building, when she heard boots on the boardwalk behind her. "Miss Cross." She turned. Gideon Ashcroft was standing outside the general store, a sack over one shoulder, looking at her with the same expression he'd had inside that store 2 weeks ago, measuring something, not unkindly. "Mr. Ashcroft." He walked toward her, not hurrying, and stopped a few feet away. He looked at the bundle against her chest, then at her face, which she was aware probably told him a fair amount about the morning she'd had. "Baby sick?" "Croup. Early stage." "You walked from the Hollis place?" "I did." He was quiet for a moment. "My wagon's at the livery. I can take you back." Her first instinct was to say no. The instinct was so automatic and so strong that she actually opened her mouth to say it before she caught herself. Because no was pride talking, and pride had no practical function in her current situation. Her feet were still numb. Clara needed to get back to warmth and steam as quickly as possible. The walk back would take longer than the walk in, because she was more tired now, and the trail was still snow-covered, and getting back after dark in these temperatures was not something she wanted to risk. "I'd appreciate that," she said. Something in his expression shifted. Not surprise exactly, but a kind of respect, like he'd expected her to say no and was interested to find she hadn't. "Give me 10 minutes, he said. The wagon was not comfortable. It was a working vehicle, not a passenger one, flatbed with a bench seat up front and the sack of feed he'd picked up taking up most of the bed. But he had a wool blanket on the seat that he hadn't had to offer because she hadn't asked for it, and the horse moved at a pace that ate the ground efficiently, and they covered in 40 minutes what she'd taken 2.5 hours on foot. They didn't talk much. She appreciated that. He was the kind of man who didn't feel the need to fill silence, which was rarer than it should have been. About halfway back, Clara made a small sound from inside the wrapping, the particular complaint of an infant who has decided she's been patient long enough. "She's got a temper," Gideon said. "She was born annoyed," Elena said. "She came into the world frowning. I think she's been managing her opinion of the circumstances since day one." He almost smiled. She caught the edge of it before it disappeared. "How long have you been up there?" he asked. "Almost a month." He didn't say anything to that for a long moment. Then, "The fireplace in that cabin draws poorly. Hollis never fixed the flue right. If you get smoke backing up on you, it's the damper. It sits crooked. You have to push it left and up at the same time." She filed that away. "I noticed it ran smoky. I thought it was the green wood." "Partly that too. They came down the ridge road to the turnoff, and he pulled the wagon as far as the terrain allowed, which was about 200 yards short of the cabin. "I can walk from here," she said. "I know you can," he said. She climbed down, shifted Clara in the sling, picked up her satchel. She hesitated. "Thank you, Mr. Ashcroft." "Gideon," he said. "Mr. Ashcroft is my father, and he's been dead 8 years." He paused. "I come up this way most Saturdays, checking the upper fence line. He stopped and started again, like he'd thought better of one phrasing and was looking for a different one. "If you ever need something from town and can't make the walk, you can leave a note at the birch tree on the ridge road. The split one, you'll know it. I'll see it." She looked at him for a moment. He was looking at the horse's ears. "Why?" she asked. He turned then and met her eyes directly, and he said it the way plain people say plain things. "Because you walked 4 miles in February with a sick baby, and nobody helped you, and that's not—" He stopped. "It's just not right, that's all." She nodded once. "All right." She walked back to the cabin. Clara's fever broke 2 days later. Elena was sitting by the fire with her in the middle of the night when she felt it. The heat in the small body lessening, the breathing easing out of that labored rasp and settling into something quieter and more natural. She sat very still for a long time, one hand on her daughter's back, feeling the even rise and fall. And she did not cry because she had been making deals with herself about crying. Not yet, not yet. But her eyes went hot, and her throat closed up, and she had to look at the ceiling for a while. "Okay," she said finally, very quietly. "Okay. We're still here." The fire crackled. Outside, the wind had dropped to nothing for the first time in weeks, and the silence it left behind was the deepest, cleanest thing she had heard in as long as she could remember. Clara slept on her chest, warm and breathing easy. Elena stayed awake another hour, just to be sure, and then, finally, she slept too. 2 Saturdays later, she found a sack hanging from the birch tree on the ridge road. Inside, a pound of dried beef, a small wheel of hard cheese, and a jar of apple preserves wrapped in cloth. No note, nothing to identify the sender. She carried it back to the cabin and stood in the middle of the room holding it for a moment. This small, practical, completely unsentimental act of someone deciding she was worth something without making a production of it. She put the preserves on the shelf. Her mother's thimble was up there too, the only decoration the cabin had. And she looked at the two objects side by side, something she'd held on to from before and something new. She made coffee that afternoon for the first time since leaving the ranch. She'd found a small bag of grounds in the general store order she'd sorted through and forgotten about. She sat by the fire with the tin mug warming both her hands and drank it slowly, watching Clara sleep in the nest of fabric on the sleeping platform. And she thought about the sack on the birch tree and about flues that drew crooked and about what it meant when someone showed you they were paying attention without needing you to thank them for it. March was still 2 weeks away. The cold was not done with her. But for the first time since the night she'd walked off the Cross Ranch porch, Elena felt something that wasn't quite hope and wasn't quite confidence, but was somewhere between the two. A sense that the ground under her feet was getting slightly more solid, day by day, under the slow, uneven, expensive work of building something from nothing. She didn't trust it yet. She'd learned not to trust things too soon. But she didn't push it away either. She finished the coffee. She banked the fire. She checked on Clara one more time. Warm, sleeping, fists clenched in that characteristic way, braced for whatever came next. She pulled the canvas over herself on the platform and closed her eyes. Outside, for the first time in weeks, it was completely still. Spring came to the territory the way it always did. Not all at once, not with any particular announcement, but in increments so small you almost missed them. A week where the overnight temperature stayed above 10 degrees for the first time since November. A morning where the light came through the cabin's one small window at a different angle and landed on the floor in a way that looked almost warm. The birch tree on the ridge road putting out the first cautious suggestion of buds, pale green against gray bark, testing the air before committing. Elena noticed all of it. She had learned, over the winter, to pay attention to small things. It was a skill the cold had taught her by force, because in February, small things were the difference between a fire that stayed lit and one that didn't, between a roof that held and one that didn't, Between Clara sleeping through the night and Clara waking at 3 in the morning with that hoarse, unhappy cough that still made Elena's chest seize up, even after the croup had been long gone. Clara was 3 months old now and had developed opinions. She had opinions about which position she preferred to be held in. Upright, always, never cradled, she would arch her back and complain at being cradled until Elena adjusted. And about what constituted an acceptable waiting time between deciding she was hungry and being fed, which was approximately no time at all. She had opinions about the fire, which she would stare at for long stretches with an expression of deep concentration, as if she were studying it and would have notes later. She had her mother's hairline and increasingly a personality that Elena was starting to recognize as something wholly her own, not Elena's, not Thomas Reeves's, not anyone's inheritance. Just Clara. She was not an easy baby. Elena had decided she was glad about that. The arrangement with Gideon had developed through the winter in the gradual, unannounced way that practical things develop between practical people. The sack on the birch tree had appeared 4 more Saturdays in a row after that first one, varying in contents. Once a bolt of canvas she'd been able to use to patch the north corner properly, once a sack of oats, once a small jar of the eucalyptus oil Dr. Pierce had recommended that she'd run out of. She'd left things in return, twice a folded note with a list of what she actually needed so he wasn't guessing, and once, this had taken her 3 days to decide on, a small jar of the preserves she'd put up from dried fruit, recooked with water, and a little sugar she'd rationed carefully, because she had nothing else of value to offer, and she was not a person who accepted without giving back. He had not made anything of it. That was the right instinct. In March, he'd come to the cabin directly for the first time. She'd heard the horse on the ridge road and had a moment of something that was not quite alarm but was adjacent to it. The reflexive vigilance of a woman who had spent 3 months alone teaching herself that sounds outside meant she needed to assess, and then recognized the particular unhurried sound of a single horse moving without urgency, which was different from the sound of someone approaching with intention. She'd opened the door before he knocked. He'd stood on the rotting porch step. She'd been meaning to address that step, it was on the list, with his hat in his hand and a straight board under his arm. "The porch step," he said. "I had a piece of pine sitting in my barn doing nothing." She'd looked at the board, then at him. "You cut it to length already." "I measured it off the width last time I came up the road." She'd stepped back to let him in, and he'd fixed the step in about 15 minutes, pulling the old boards with a crowbar he'd brought along, fitting the new piece, driving the nails with the systematic efficiency of someone who'd done this kind of work so long it no longer required thought. Clara had watched him from the sling with the focused attention she applied to anything new, and when he'd finished and stood up and found her staring at him, he'd looked back at her with an expression that was not quite sure what to do with an infant's scrutiny. "She judges everything," Elena told him. "She's got your eyes," he said. Elena hadn't responded to that. He hadn't seemed to expect her to. After that, he'd stopped coming to the ridge road on Saturdays and started coming to the cabin itself, and the arrangement had shifted from Elena receiving supplies to Elena working for them, first helping with the Ashcroft Ranch's spring inventory, which he brought to her in boxes of ledger books and receipts that he carried up in the wagon because it was easier than her walking down with a baby. She worked at the table, Clara in a nest on the sleeping platform, going through years of records with the systematic accuracy that had always been her strongest practical skill. She was good at numbers. She had always been good at numbers. Raymond had used her for the cross-ranch accounts from the time she was 16 and had never once acknowledged that she was the reason their books were clean. He'd presented the results to the bank himself, taken the credit, moved on. She'd let it happen because it was simpler than fighting it, and because she had understood, in the practical way of daughters raised by certain kinds of fathers, that there were some recognitions she simply wasn't going to get. Gideon's books were in worse shape than she'd expected from a man with his reputation. Not dishonest. She could tell the difference between disorganized and falsified. And his were simply disorganized, years of receipts stuffed in roughly chronological order, accounts that hadn't been properly reconciled, a pattern of land payment records that had been tracked in 3 different ledgers with 3 different systems depending on which year you looked at. "Who kept these before?" she asked him, on his second visit to collect the completed work. "I did," he said. He said it in a tone that acknowledged the obvious problem without defensiveness about it. You organize them by ranch season instead of calendar year. It makes the tax records impossible to follow. I pay what they tell me to pay. You've been overpaying, she said. She turned the ledger to face him and put her finger on a column. Your 1877 grazing fee was calculated against the full acreage, but you leased the North 40 to the Brennan family from April through August. You should have had a partial credit. Nobody caught it. He looked at the column. How much? Across 3 years of the same error? $47. He was quiet for a moment. You're sure? I'm sure. He looked at her with an expression she'd started to recognize. The recalibrating look, the adjustment upward she'd first seen in Bert Calloway's store, but more direct than that, without the uncertainty behind it. Like he was looking at something and putting it accurately in its category, rather than searching for a category to fit it into. I'd like to offer you a formal arrangement, he said, managing the Ashcroft accounts, monthly rate. She'd been expecting something like this, and she'd thought about how to handle it. I can't come to the ranch regularly, not until Clara's older. I know, I'll bring the books here. She thought about it, not long. What's the rate? He named a number. It was fair. She'd have argued if it wasn't, and she thought he knew that. Agreed, she said. That had been 6 weeks ago. It was now mid-April, and Elena had worked through 5 years of Ashcroft ranch records, reorganized them into a single coherent system, filed corrected figures with the Territorial Land Office for the overpayment she'd found, and begun working forward from the current year with a method that would actually be maintainable. She was good at it. She'd forgotten how much she liked it. The particular satisfaction of numbers that resolved cleanly, of a column that balanced, of a system working the way it was supposed to work. And then she found the anomaly, but it was in the land transfer records. She'd been cross-referencing Gideon's boundary descriptions against the territorial survey maps he kept in the bottom of the largest document box. She'd pulled them out because she needed to verify an acreage figure for the 1878 grazing calculation. When she noticed that 2 of the survey map reference numbers didn't match the corresponding Territorial Land Office receipt numbers she had in the 1876 ledger. It was a small thing, the kind of thing that could be a clerical error, a copying mistake, the ordinary friction of bureaucratic systems that didn't always speak the same language. She would have moved on from it in 3 minutes if the discrepancy had been consistent. One system consistently using one numbering format, the other consistently using another. But it wasn't consistent. The numbers matched on every parcel except these 2, and the 2 that didn't match were both in the same section of the territory, roughly 4 miles northeast of the Ashcroft boundary. She set the survey maps aside and went back through the ledger more carefully. Then she went through the next year's ledger, and the year after that. The pattern she found took her 2 hours to fully trace, and by the time she understood what she was looking at, she was sitting very still at the table with the ledgers open in front of her, and Clara asleep on the platform, and the fire burning down without her noticing, and her mind was doing the thing it did when it was working through something important. Going very quiet and very precise, stripping away everything except the numbers and what the numbers said. What the numbers said was this. Over a period of at least 5 years, parcels of frontier land adjacent to or overlapping the Ashcroft Ranch's territorial boundary had been transferred through the land office using reference numbers that didn't match the original survey records. The transfers appeared legitimate on the surface. Fees paid, signatures present, correctly filed with the territorial administration. But the original survey designations had been altered. In each case, the altered survey placed the boundary of the purchased parcel slightly differently than the original survey had. In each case, the alteration benefited the buyer. And in each case, the buyer was a land company called Meridian Holdings. She had not heard of Meridian Holdings. She found 3 references to them in Gideon's records. Not as parties to any of his transactions, but as adjacent landowners who'd bought up parcels she now had to list as his boundary neighbors. She'd written the name down when she'd encountered it and thought nothing of it. She thought something of it now. She went back to the survey maps and looked at the full picture of what those altered boundaries meant. Parcel by parcel, the changes were small. 10 yards here, a fence line there, a creek boundary shifted by half a chain. But cumulatively, across the parcels she could identify in the record she had, Meridian Holdings had acquired an extra 400 and some acres of frontier land through boundary descriptions that didn't match what the original territorial surveys showed. 400 acres of Wyoming territory, at current valuation, was not a small number. She sat back and looked at the ceiling. "Clara," she said quietly to her sleeping daughter, "I think I found something I wasn't supposed to find." She didn't tell Gideon immediately. That decision was deliberate. She needed to be certain first, certain enough that when she brought this to him, she wasn't bringing speculation or an arithmetic error dressed up as something larger. She spent 3 more days going through everything she could access: the survey maps, the ledgers, the boundary correspondence, a stack of territorial land office notices that Gideon had received over the years and filed without reading in a cardboard box she'd initially set aside as low priority. In that box, she found 4 notices of adjacent land transfer, properly formatted, correctly stamped, sent to Gideon as required by territorial law because he was a neighboring landowner. In 2 of those transfers, the boundary descriptions in the notice didn't match the boundary descriptions in the survey map she had. Someone had changed the descriptions between the official filing and the notification sent to neighbors. The filing was what went on record. The notification was what the neighbors saw. If the neighbor didn't pull the original survey, and why would they if the notification looked routine, they'd never know. It was clean. Whoever had set this up had done it carefully, using the genuine bureaucratic machinery of the Territorial Land Office and doing just enough alteration in just the right places to move boundaries without triggering the kind of obvious alarm that blatant fraud would have triggered. The kind of scheme that required someone on the inside of the land office itself, someone with access to the original filings, the ability to alter reference numbers before they were recorded in the permanent register, and the authority to send the notifications. She wrote it all out on 6 pages in her neat, close hand. Every parcel, every discrepancy, every reference number, the calculated acreage differential, and its approximate current value. When she was done, she read through it twice and found nothing that didn't hold up. Then she told Gideon. She walked to the Ashcroft Ranch for the first time, a 2-mile walk with Clara, now that the spring had made the ground passable, and found him in the barn working on a broken harness. He looked up when she came in, registered the expression on her face, and set the harness down without her saying a word. "What happened?" She handed him the 6 pages. He read slowly. She could track where he was in the document by watching his face. The initial neutrality of someone reading something that hasn't yet resolved into meaning, then the slight shift of attention when the pattern started to emerge, then the stillness. The particular stillness of a man who has controlled himself for long enough that controlling himself has become involuntary. He turned the last page. He was quiet for a long time. "You're certain," he said. It wasn't really a question. "I verified everything I could access 3 times. The reference numbers are wrong on 8 parcels. The boundary discrepancies amount to approximately 430 acres. The purchasing entity is the same in every case." "Meridian Holdings," he said. "Do you know them?" "I know the name. I've heard it twice in the last year. Once from Ed Sutter over on the Sutter spread, who mentioned they'd tried to buy him out, and once at a territorial meeting when someone raised a question about a survey error that got dismissed as a clerical issue." He set the pages down on a hay bale and put his hands on his hips and looked at the barn floor. "I didn't connect it." "There was nothing to connect yet," she said. "It's subtle. It was designed to be." He looked up. "How did you find it?" "The reference numbers didn't match between 2 systems. Once I saw that, I looked for the same pattern elsewhere." She paused. "Gideon, if Meridian Holdings has been doing this systematically across the territory, and based on what I can see, this has been going on for at least 5 years, there are likely more ranchers affected than just the parcels I found in your records. I only have access to the surveys adjacent to your land." He absorbed that. "How much are we talking about total? If this extends across the territory?" "I don't know, but the operation is sophisticated enough that they have help inside the land office. That means they have access to every survey and every filing in the territory. The potential scale—" She stopped. "It's significant." He picked up the 6 pages again and looked at them, not reading, just looking. She watched him work through it. "We need to be careful," he said finally. "If they have someone in the land office, they may have people watching for anyone who starts pulling original surveys." I know. That's why I wanted you to know before I did anything else. What do you want to do? She had thought about this for 3 days. I want to get the original survey records from the Territorial Archive in Cheyenne, not through the local land office, directly from the archive. That's a different system, different administrators. If the alterations were made at the local level, the archive copies may still show the original designations. That's a 3-day trip to Cheyenne. I know. He looked at her for a moment. When were you planning to go? When I have the full picture of what we're dealing with here. I want to identify every parcel I can from your records first, so I know exactly what to pull from the archive. That gives me another week, maybe 10 days. He nodded slowly. And then? And then we have something real, something that can go to the territorial court. She met his eyes. If we do this, Gideon, it has to be done correctly. The moment they know someone is looking, they'll start destroying records and covering their tracks. We only get one chance at this. He held her gaze for a long moment. All right, he said. What do you need from me? Shit. What she needed from him turned out to be more complicated than either of them anticipated. She needed access to records he didn't know he had. She needed time, real, extended time at the ranch where she could work through the full archive of boundary correspondence and survey files rather than the boxes he'd been hauling to the cabin. She needed Clara to have somewhere to be while she worked, which was a problem she'd been turning over since the idea had formed, because she didn't ask people to mind her daughter, and she was not comfortable starting now. Gideon's ranch cook was a woman named May, who was 62, built like a person who had been doing physical labor her entire life and intended to continue, and who had made her position on Clara immediately clear on Elena's first visit to the ranch by taking the baby out of Elena's arms the moment she walked in the door with the confidence of someone who had raised several children and did not require permission. You work, May had said. I'll keep her. Elena had stood in the kitchen holding nothing for a moment, feeling the particular disoriented weight of a woman who had not put her daughter down voluntarily in 3 months. She's going to want to eat in about 2 hours, Elena said. I've fed babies before, May said, already walking toward the window with Clara, showing her something outside. Go. She'd gone. She worked at the ranch table for 6 days. May fed Clara in the kitchen and reported her progress with the brevity of someone who found excessive communication inefficient, eating fine, sleeping fine, found something on the wall she likes to stare at. And Elena worked through correspondence files and boundary maps with a systematic attention that cleared through 5 years of accumulated paper in a way that was beginning to frighten her, because the more she found, the larger the picture became. It wasn't just the parcels adjacent to the Ashcroft boundary. There were 3 separate correspondence threads in Gideon's files, letters from other ranchers he'd maintained professional contact with over the years, that contained incidental references to survey discrepancies they'd dismissed as errors or pursued without satisfaction through the local land office. Ed Sutter's letter from 1879 mentioned a boundary dispute that had been resolved by the office in favor of the Meridian Company. A letter from a rancher named Cal Briggs, dated 1878, described a parcel transfer adjacent to his north fence that didn't sit right, but that the land office had confirmed as legitimate. Both of those ranchers had lost land. Both of them had gone through the local land office and gotten nowhere. Neither of them had compared notes with the other, because why would they? They were 20 miles apart, and their disputes looked from the outside like ordinary boundary disagreements. Elena wrote to both of them. She kept the letters careful, explaining she was reviewing territorial survey records for accounting purposes, asking whether they would be willing to share their survey documentation. She did not say what she thought she'd found. She sent the letters through the Hatchet Creek post office on a Tuesday afternoon and spent the walk home thinking about how much time she had before someone noticed what she was doing. Less than she wanted, more than 0. She intended to use every minute of it. The trouble arrived on a Thursday. She was at the ranch table with the 1877 boundary correspondence spread across the full surface when she heard horses in the yard. Not one, which was Gideon, but multiple, which was something else. She heard Gideon's voice outside, and then another voice she didn't recognize. And then the particular cadence of a conversation that was not going the way one party wanted it to. She kept working. She listened. After 10 minutes, the front door opened and Gideon came in alone. He closed it behind him with the deliberate care of a man managing his own reaction. "Who was that?" Elena asked. "A man named Foster Crane." He crossed to the table and stood there with his arms at his sides, looking at the spread of papers. "He represents a legal firm out of Laramie. He says they represent a consortium of investors with interests in the territory. He said he's heard I've been having my records reviewed and wanted to offer the services of his firm to ensure everything is properly filed." She set down her pencil. "How did he know about the review?" "That," Gideon said, "is the right question." She looked at him. He looked at the papers on the table. "What did you tell him?" she asked. "I told him my records were private business, and I wasn't aware that required any outside attention." He paused. He was polite. Very polite. The kind of polite that's a different word for something else. She understood what he meant. The kind of polite that comes with the understanding that you should hear a warning in it, even if nothing in the words themselves is threatening. "They know," she said. "Something," Gideon said. "Not everything. If they knew everything, Crane wouldn't have knocked on my door to be polite. He'd have sent someone with a court order." He looked at her. "How close are we?" "I need the Cheyenne archive. I have the pattern, I have the discrepancies, I have the correspondence from 2 other ranchers who were likely victims of the same scheme. What I don't have yet is the original survey records that prove the filings were altered. Without those originals, everything I have is circumstantial." "How long does it take to get the Cheyenne records?" "If I write to the archive tomorrow with a specific list of survey numbers, which I can do, I have the numbers, they can pull them and send copies. 10 days, maybe 12. He sat down in the chair across from her. He was quiet for a moment, and she recognized the quality of that quiet. Not hesitation, but assessment, running the variables. "Then we have 12 days, he said, "before they figure out what we have and decide being polite isn't working anymore." She nodded. She was already writing the list of survey numbers. "Elena," his voice was different. She looked up. "These are not small men. Meridian Holdings. If this is what it looks like, they have territorial officials in their pocket and legal representation in 3 cities, and the kind of money that makes problems disappear. You understand what you're stepping into." "I found it in your records," she said. "That makes it your problem too." "I know that. I'm talking about you specifically. You walked into a frontier town with nothing in November and built yourself a life with $12 and a broken cabin. You didn't need to make yourself a target on top of that." She looked at him steadily. "They stole 400 acres from you. They stole land from Ed Sutter and Cal Briggs, and probably from 20 other families whose names I haven't found yet. I found the evidence. I'm the one who knows how to read it." She picked up her pencil. "I'm not sitting down because it's dangerous." He held her gaze for a moment. "No," he said. "I didn't think you would." He stood up. He went to the kitchen. He came back with 2 cups of coffee and set one on the table next to her elbow, without comment. She wrote the letter to the Cheyenne archive that evening, 12 pages, survey numbers, parcel descriptions, specific records she needed. She sealed it herself. She gave it to Gideon to take to the Laramie post office the next morning. Not Hatchet Creek, which was too close, too visible, where someone might notice. And she sat at his table and watched him ride out through the window and felt the particular coldness of a person who has committed to a course of action and is now waiting on the part they can't control. May came and put Clara in her arms without being asked. Elena held her daughter and looked out the window at the empty yard where Gideon had been and thought about how quickly the territory could shift under your feet. How 6 months ago she had been a woman without a floor to stand on, and now she was standing on ground that was her own, built from nothing, and people with serious money and serious resources had noticed. They had made a mistake, she thought, when they assumed she would be easy to move. They had made the same mistake her father had. The same mistake Thomas Reeves had. The same mistake this territory had made every time it assumed that a woman with limited options had no options. Clara pulled at Elena's collar with one small fist and made the sound that meant she was losing patience with the current situation. "I know," Elena said. "Me too." The letter was already on its way to Cheyenne. Now they waited. The archive records from Cheyenne arrived on the 11th day. Gideon brought them from Laramie himself, riding back in the late afternoon with a leather satchel strapped across the saddle. A different satchel than the one Elena had carried out of the Cross Ranch in November, but the sight of it crossing the yard made something in her chest tighten anyway. the way certain shapes carry weight that has nothing to do with their current contents. She was at the window when he rode in. She had the door open before he reached the porch. He handed her the satchel without a word and went to put up the horse. She took it to the table. The archive had sent 17 survey documents, original territorial survey records, each one stamped with the Cheyenne Archive seal and dated at filing, each one covering one of the parcels she'd identified in her letter. She spread them across the table in the order she'd requested them, then pulled out her own compiled record of the local land office reference numbers and the boundary descriptions from the transfer notifications. She went through them one by one. 12 of the 17 showed discrepancies. Not all in the same place, not all of the same size, but in every case, the original Cheyenne Archive survey said something different than what the local land office had filed as the official territorial record. Boundary lines moved. Reference numbers altered. In 3 cases, the acreage figures themselves had been changed. Small adjustments, less than 5%, the kind of difference that would read as a rounding correction if you weren't looking for a pattern. She was looking for a pattern. She found it every time. She had been at the table for 2 hours when Gideon came in from the barn, poured himself coffee from the pot May kept on the stove, and came to stand at the table behind her. He looked at the spread of documents without speaking for a moment. "Tell me," he said. 12 of the 17 parcels show altered records. The alterations were made to the local land office filings. The copies held in Cheyenne are clean. The originals say one thing. What was filed at the local level says another. She pointed to the first survey sheet. "This is your northeast corner boundary, parcel 14 in your records. The archive shows your neighbor's eastern line running 11 yards further east than what the local filing says. That 11 yards cuts into the grazing corridor you've been using since 1874. The meridian fence," he said quietly, "the meridian fence is sitting on your land. Not by accident." She moved to the next set of documents. Ed Sutter's situation is worse. The archive shows 2 parcels where the acreage was reduced in the local filing. He paid tax on the corrected figure and never questioned why it changed, because the land office told him the original survey had a calculation error. There was no calculation error. Someone changed the number. Gideon set his coffee cup down. "What's the total value across all 12 parcels?" Conservatively, at current territorial land valuations, Meridian Holdings has acquired the benefit of approximately $11,000 worth of frontier land through altered records. She looked up at him. "That's only what I can document from the surveys I requested. This has been going on for at least 5 years. There may be parcels I don't know to look for." He was quiet for a long time. The kitchen sounds from the other room, May doing something with pots, Clara making the commentary sounds she'd recently discovered she could produce, were the only noise in the house. "We need a lawyer," he said. "We need the right lawyer, not someone from Laramie, not someone with any connection to the territorial administration here. Someone from outside the territory who has no existing relationships with the people we're going to be pointing at." "I know someone in Denver," he said. "Arthur Pemberton. He handled a water rights case for a rancher I know. He's thorough, and he's not cheap, and he doesn't owe anything to anyone in Wyoming territory. Can you reach him?" "I can wire him from Laramie tomorrow." She nodded and turned back to the documents. She was already thinking about how to organize them. What order told the story most clearly? What evidence needed to sit next to what other evidence to make the pattern undeniable rather than suggestive? A court didn't want to be made to see something. It wanted to be walked to it by a path so clear that looking away required deliberate effort. She had built that kind of path before, in the Cross Ranch accounts, laying the numbers out for the bank in the way that made the ranch's situation legible to people who hadn't been living inside it for years. She was good at making complex things clear. She was going to need that now, more than she ever had. She worked until the lamp oil ran low, and then she worked by firelight until Gideon told her it was past 11 and she was going to ruin her eyes. And she told him she had 4 more comparisons to run, and he said nothing further and went to find another lamp. Foster Crane came back 5 days later. This time he didn't come alone. He had 2 men with him that he didn't introduce, which told you everything you needed to know about what they were there for. They weren't legal associates. They had the particular stillness of men who were paid to stand near things and make those things feel smaller. Elena was at the ranch when he arrived. She'd moved most of her work to the Ashcroft house by then. The cabin was too far from the documents she needed, and May had made the question of Clara moot by simply absorbing the baby into her daily routine with the efficiency of someone who considered the matter settled. Gideon had offered Elena the spare room without making anything of it, and she'd taken it without making anything of it either, because the practical situation required it, and making things of things was a luxury that used up energy she didn't have. She heard the horses. She stayed at the table. Gideon went out. She listened through the window she'd left open 2 inches despite the still cool April air, because listening was information. Crane's voice was pleasant. It was a studied pleasantness, the kind you developed if you spent enough time being paid to deliver messages that the recipients weren't going to like. Mr. Ashcroft, my clients have become aware that certain proprietary records related to territorial land transactions have been removed from the local land office and are being held privately. My clients are concerned that these records, which relate to confidential business arrangements, may be misrepresented or misused. Your client's records, Gideon said, wouldn't be in my house. I'm speaking of territorial survey documents, Mr. Ashcroft, original filings. I've requested copies of surveys relating to my own property from the Territorial Archive. That's my right as a landowner. A pause. Certainly. My clients simply want to ensure that any concerns about survey accuracy are directed through the appropriate legal channels, rather than what? Gideon's voice was unchanged, flat, almost conversational. Rather than a court. Another pause, this one longer. My clients are prepared to offer a settlement for any boundary disputes that can be documented, Mr. Ashcroft. A fair market valuation for any land. I'm not interested in selling. I don't think you understand the nature of... I understand it fine. Gideon's voice had not changed in pitch or volume. That was something Elena had noticed about him over the months. He never got louder when he was serious. He got quieter. You can tell your clients that if they have a legal position, they're welcome to bring it to a court of law. My attorney is Arthur Pemberton, out of Denver. Any communication can go through him. A beat of silence. Mr. Pemberton, Crane said, and she could hear something shifting in his pleasantness, something cooling. That's a significant investment for a boundary dispute. I'm a significant rancher, Gideon said. Good afternoon, Mr. Crane. She heard the boots on the porch, the door, Gideon coming back inside. He came directly to the table where she was sitting and did not bother to look out the window to watch Crane leave. They know Pemberton's name, Elena said. Yes. Which means they'll know by tomorrow that we've actually retained him. Yes. He sat down across from her. How much time does that buy us? Not enough, but Pemberton arrives Thursday. The court filing can go in Friday morning if we have everything ready. She looked at him directly. We need to be filed before they can get an injunction to block access to the archive records. Once the case is before a judge, the records are protected as evidence. Then we need everything ready by Thursday night. I know. She went back to work. Arthur Pemberton was a short man with an unremarkable face and the eyes of someone who had spent 30 years reading documents for the specific purpose of finding what other people didn't want found. He arrived Thursday afternoon, shook Gideon's hand, shook Elena's hand with no particular comment on the situation, sat down at the table, and started reading. He read for 4 hours. He asked 6 questions during that time, each one precise, each one aimed at something she hadn't addressed in the written summary. She answered all 6 without hesitation and with the documentation to support each answer within arm's reach because she had anticipated the questions. Not all 6 exactly, but the type, the angle of attack a lawyer would use to stress test the evidence before he staked his reputation on it. When he finished, he stacked the documents in the order he'd rearranged them while reading and put his hands flat on the table. This is enough, he said. If the original archive records hold up to examination in court, and I see no reason they wouldn't, they're government documents with a clear chain of custody. This is enough to establish a pattern of systematic fraud at the local land office level and direct financial benefit to Meridian Holdings. What about the inside person? Elena asked. Someone in the land office had to be making the alterations. The pattern of alterations is itself the evidence. We don't need to name the individual yet to make the initial filing. The filing establishes the fraud, the investigation finds the person. He looked at her. Who compiled this? I did. You're not an attorney. No, I manage ranch accounts. He looked at the 12 parcel analysis she'd prepared, the side-by-side comparison of original archive figures versus local land office figures, the cumulative calculation, the correspondence from Sutter and Briggs that she'd finally received, both of them writing back with a barely contained anger that told her she'd found the right thread. He looked at all of it. This is better organized than most legal briefs I've received from actual attorneys, he said. It was not a compliment delivered with warmth. It was a statement of fact from a man who didn't waste compliments. Can you be in court? When? The filing goes in tomorrow. Given the nature of the case and the involvement of territorial officials, I expect the judge will want to move quickly. Within the week, possibly sooner. Can you appear as a witness and walk the court through the documentary evidence? She thought about Clara, about May, about the 12 parcel analysis spread across the table. Yes, she said. They will try to discredit you, Pemberton said. Meridian Holdings has retained counsel. We have to assume they know about the filing before the ink is dry, given their apparent access to local administration. Their attorney will attack your qualifications, your personal history, your connection to Ashcroft, your motivation. It will not be comfortable. No, she said. I don't imagine it will be. He held her gaze for a moment, assessing something. Then he nodded once and picked up his pen. The filing went in on Friday. By Saturday afternoon, Hatchet Creek knew about it. She wasn't surprised. The territorial court filing was public record by law, and a fraud case naming Meridian Holdings and citing systematic alteration of land office records across 7 years was not the kind of thing that stayed quiet in a territory where land was the only thing that mattered. She was in the general store, she and May, Clara in the sling, buying flour, when she first understood the filing had landed the way a stone lands in still water, ripples moving outward faster than you could track. Bert Calloway was behind the counter, and for the first time in the 6 months she'd been coming into his store, he looked at her differently. Not with the assessing caution he'd had in November, not with the careful neutrality he'd maintained through the winter. He looked at her with something that was almost deference, and it took her a moment to recognize it because it was unfamiliar coming in her direction. Miss Cross, he said, I heard about the filing. It's public record, she said. Ed Sutter came in this morning. He said, Calloway stopped, organized whatever he was going to say. He said he'd been trying to get someone to look at that boundary issue for 2 years. The land office kept telling him the survey was correct. It wasn't, Elena said. No. He was quiet for a moment. There are others. You should know that. I've heard things over the years, ranchers complaining about survey errors that never got fixed, land office giving them the runaround. He stopped again. I didn't put it together. Most people didn't. It was designed that way. He nodded. He filled her flour order without further conversation, but when she picked up the package, he said, You need anything, Miss Cross, for the case. Anything I can do. He said it awkwardly, like a man unaccustomed to offering things and not sure he'd done it right. Thank you, Mr. Calloway, she said. She walked out into the April afternoon and stood on the boardwalk for a moment. Clara warm against her chest, the flower under her arm, the street of Hatchet Creek laid out in front of her. The same street she'd walked into in November with numb feet and a sick baby, and the particular invisibility of a woman that the town had already written off. It felt different now. Not triumphant. Not simple. Just different. In the way that things feel different when the shape of what's true about you has changed in the world's eye, even though it hasn't changed in your own. She walked back to the Ashcroft Ranch. The hearing was set for Wednesday. Pemberton had been right about the speed. Judge Harold Crane, no relation to Foster as far as anyone could verify, had looked at the filing and at Meridian Holdings' immediate counter-motion to dismiss, and had apparently decided that the counter-motion itself was interesting enough to warrant a full hearing rather than a desk ruling. Elena took this as a good sign. A judge who wanted to dismiss a nuisance case did it without a hearing. Meridian Holdings' attorney was a man named Voss from Cheyenne, and he was exactly the kind of lawyer that Elena had expected. Expensive suit, clipped speech, the practiced confidence of someone who had walked into territorial courtrooms many times and understood which levers to pull. He looked at Elena once when she came in with Pemberton and Gideon, and the look was the particular assessment of a man deciding how much of a problem she was going to be. She met his eyes and didn't look away and went to her seat. The courtroom in Hatchet Creek was a single room in the back of the county building. Wood-paneled, 2 rows of benches, a judge's bench that was a desk on a raised platform, windows that let in good light from the east in the morning, which was when the hearing started. The room was full. She hadn't expected that. She'd been so focused on the documents and the testimony that she hadn't thought about spectators. But the benches were packed, ranchers, townspeople, faces she recognized and faces she didn't. Ed Sutter was in the second row. Cal Briggs had come from 20 miles away. She saw Bert Calloway near the back. She sat at the plaintiff's table with Pemberton to her left, and the 12-parcel analysis and all supporting documentation stacked in front of her in the order she and Pemberton had worked out the night before, and she breathed slowly and looked at the documents and reminded herself that what she had was real. Not impressive, not persuasive. Real. Real was enough. Real was more than enough. Real was the only thing that mattered in a courtroom. Judge Crane came in, sat down, looked at the room over his glasses with the expression of a man who had seen a great deal and was not easily moved by spectacle. Ashcroft versus Meridian Holdings and the Territorial Land Office of Hatchet Creek, case number 1880-41. He looked at the counter motion in front of him. Mr. Voss, you've moved to dismiss on grounds that the plaintiff lacks standing and that the alleged documentary evidence is speculative. I've read your motion. I want to hear the evidence before I rule on either count. Mr. Pemberton, you may proceed. Pemberton stood. He was brief, which Elena had come to understand was deliberate. He didn't use words to fill space. He used them to cut. He outlined the case in 7 minutes. The discovery of discrepant boundary records, the comparison with Cheyenne Archive originals, the pattern across 12 parcels over 7 years, the cumulative financial impact, the common beneficiary. He sat down. Voss stood. He was less brief. He questioned the chain of custody of the archive documents, questioned the qualifications of the person who had compiled the analysis, questioned whether boundary discrepancies of the scale involved might be attributable to surveying inconsistencies rather than deliberate alteration, questioned whether Meridian Holdings could reasonably be held responsible for potential errors by the land office without evidence of direct involvement. He was good. Elena had to give him that. He identified every weak joint in the structure and pushed on each one with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done exactly this in rooms like this before. Judge Crane listened to all of it, making occasional notes. The court would like to examine the documentary evidence, he said. Miss Cross, as the individual who compiled and analyzed this material, the court will hear your testimony. She stood. She was aware of the room, the benches full, Voss watching her, Gideon at the plaintiff's table with his hands quiet on the surface in front of him. She was aware of all of it, and then she put it aside, the way she put aside everything that wasn't the immediate problem, when the immediate problem required her full attention. She walked the court through it. She started with the methodology, how she'd found the initial discrepancy, what had prompted her to look further, how she'd cross-referenced the local filings against the Cheyenne Archive records. She explained the reference numbering system in plain language, because she'd learned from years of presenting the cross-ranch accounts to Raymond that the moment you lost your audience in technical detail, you'd lost them entirely. She made it clear. She made it simple without making it simplistic. Then she laid out the 12 parcels. She went through each one, the original archive boundary description, the local land office filing, the difference between them, the parcel dimensions, the name of the landowner who had lost the acreage, the entity that had gained it. She had a chart, 1 page, hand-drawn, clear, that showed the cumulative picture visually because numbers were her language but not everyone's, and she wanted the court to see the pattern the way she had seen it, as something unmistakable once you knew where to look. Voss cross-examined her for 40 minutes. He came at her credentials first. She was not a licensed surveyor. She was not an attorney. She was the bookkeeper of one of the plaintiffs, which created obvious bias. I'm the person who found the evidence, she said. My employment with Mr. Ashcroft is what gave me access to records that made the comparison possible. The evidence is the archive documents, not my opinion of them. The archive documents speak for themselves. He came at the methodology. How could she be certain the archive records were the originals and not themselves copies that might contain errors? The Cheyenne archive stamps are dated at filing, she said. The dates predate the local land office transfers by an average of 8 months. The archive records are the source documents. The local filings are the derived records. If there are errors, they occur in the direction of the derivation. He came at the acreage figures. Survey measurement in the territory was not exact science. Different surveyors using different methods might produce slightly different boundary descriptions for the same parcel. I anticipated that objection, she said, and she heard Voss's rhythm break slightly. Just slightly, but she heard it. The discrepancies in this case are not random. Random survey error would distribute in both directions. Some adjustments favoring the original landowner, some favoring adjacent parties. In all 12 cases, the adjustment favors the same purchasing entity. The probability of that occurring by chance across 12 independent parcels is... She gave the number she'd calculated. She'd checked it 3 times. Statistically indistinguishable from 0. The courtroom was quiet. Voss looked at his notes. He looked at her. He tried 2 more angles, both of which she answered from the documents rather than from her own assertion, keeping herself out of it as much as possible. She was not the evidence. The archive records were the evidence, and every time he tried to make the case about her, she redirected it back to the paper. He sat down. Judge Crane looked at the documents she'd submitted. He looked at the chart. He looked at her for a moment, and she could not read his expression, and she sat down and breathed slowly and did not look at Gideon because looking at Gideon right now was not something she could afford. Then Ed Sutter stood up from the second row. He said, without being called, without Pemberton asking, simply standing up in the way of a man who has been waiting to say something for 2 years and has run out of patience for the appropriate moment. Judge, I lost 60 acres on my north fence to that Meridian fence line. I went to the land office 3 times. They told me the survey was correct. I'm looking at what this woman just put in front of you, and I can show you exactly where that fence is sitting on my land. Judge Crane looked at him for a moment. Mr. Sutter, you'll have the opportunity to submit a formal statement to the court. I'm submitting it now, Sutter said. He was not a young man. He had the look of someone who had spent his life outdoors and had very little left to lose. I've got 2 neighbors in this room who can say the same thing. Cal Briggs, Hank Morrison, they're both here. Briggs raised his hand from the back bench. Morrison, a man Elena didn't know, nodded from beside him. She had not known about Morrison. There was another one she hadn't known about. The judge looked at the room. He looked at Voss, whose pleasant expression had been getting progressively harder to maintain for the last hour. He looked at his notes. The court will recess for 1 hour, Judge Crane said. Mr. Voss, I'd suggest your clients consider carefully the scope of this situation before we reconvene. Mr. Pemberton, I'll want statements from Sutter, Briggs, and Morrison on the record this afternoon. He stood. The motion to dismiss is denied. The room exhaled. She felt it rather than heard it. A collective release of held breath from the benches behind her. Pemberton put his hand briefly on the table next to her documents. Not on her hand. On the table. It was, she understood, his version of something warmer. Well done, he said quietly. She looked at the documents stacked in front of her. 12 parcels, 7 years of systematic theft. 3 ranchers in the room who had lost land they'd worked for years, and probably others who hadn't known yet to come forward, who would know by next week, whose names she didn't have yet, but who would start to appear now that the pattern was public. She was tired in a way that went below her bones, into something older and more fundamental than fatigue. She was tired the way you are when you have been carrying something heavy for a very long time and have just been allowed to set it down somewhere it won't be picked up and moved again. Gideon was looking at her. She hadn't turned, but she knew it the way you know certain things about certain people after months of working beside them, through the kind of winter that strips everything down to what's actually there. She turned. His expression was not complicated. It was the honest face of a man who is looking at someone he respects the way you respect very few things. Not with sentiment, not with the softened gaze of someone projecting a feeling onto a person, but with the clear eyes of someone who has watched, over months, exactly what a person is made of, and has updated their understanding accordingly. "You did that," he said. "The documents did that," she said. "You made the documents matter." He held her gaze. "There's a difference." She looked away first, not because it was uncomfortable exactly, but because some things you can only hold for a moment before they become too much of what they are. Outside, through the courtroom's east windows, the April afternoon was fully arrived. The sky, that specific Wyoming blue that shows up in spring, clean and high, and immoderate in its brightness after the long gray of winter. The recess ended. The afternoon began. By 4 o'clock, Ed Sutter's statement was on the record, Cal Briggs was on the record, Hank Morrison had added a 7th year to the timeline that Elena hadn't had. Voss made 3 more motions. All 3 were denied. The judge scheduled a full evidentiary hearing for the following Monday and issued a preservation order on all local land office records pending investigation, which meant that anyone who might have been inclined to make certain files disappear over the weekend was now a person who would be doing so in violation of a court order. She walked out of the courthouse at 5 in the afternoon into the orange slant light of early evening, Gideon beside her, Pemberton behind them gathering his papers, and the street of Hatchet Creek in front of her. She didn't feel victorious. She hadn't expected to. She felt the particular exhaustion that comes after sustained, precise effort, the come down of a mind that has been running at full capacity for weeks and has just downshifted slightly. Not stopped, not safe yet, but downshifted. She felt the cold air, which was still present in the evenings even in April. She felt Clara kick in the sling, impatient. "She's been very patient today," May said from behind her. May had been in the courtroom from the third bench, Clara in her arms, the entire time, which Elena had not asked her to do and which she would not have known how to ask. "She was probably judging the proceedings," Elena said. "She fell asleep during your testimony," May said. "Snored through the whole thing." Gideon made a sound that was not quite a laugh. It was the closest thing to one she'd heard from him in months. She took Clara back and held her daughter against her chest in the cooling evening air, and she looked at the orange-lit street and the mountains behind the town and the long, flat reach of the valley beyond, and she thought about a night in November when she'd walked away from everything she had ever known into the cold dark, and how far that walk had brought her, and what it had cost, and what it had made. The case wasn't over. Monday was still coming, but tonight she had done something that couldn't be undone. She started walking toward the livery where the wagon was. Monday came the way hard things come, not with drama, not with warning weather, or any particular sign that the day was different from the one before it. The sun came up the same way it always did over the eastern ridge, throwing that long, flat light across the valley floor, and Elena was already awake when it happened, sitting at the table in the Ashcroft house with a cup of coffee she'd made before May was up, going through the documents one final time. Not because she didn't know them. She knew them the way she knew Clara's face, the way she knew the distance from the cabin to the birch tree on the ridge road, the way she knew every beam in a structure she'd built herself. She went through them because going through them was what her hands needed to do, while her mind ran ahead to the courtroom and worked through every angle Voss had left to try. He had one left. She'd identified it Saturday night and had been sitting with it since. The chain of custody on the archive documents was clean. Pemberton had verified that, and the preservation order protected the local records from interference going forward. The pattern across 12 parcels was documented and now corroborated by 3 additional ranchers whose testimony was on the record. The statistical argument was solid. What Voss had left was the human element. He couldn't break the documents, so he was going to try to break her. She'd known this was coming since Pemberton had told her in the first meeting. She'd thought about it for 2 weeks. She had not found a way to make it not true that she was an unmarried woman with an infant, no formal credentials, employed by the plaintiff, with a family estrangement that a skilled attorney could frame as a pattern of instability if he wanted to be ugly about it. She couldn't make those facts different. She could only be so certain of the ones that mattered that the others couldn't move her. She drank her coffee. She went through the documents. Clara slept in the back room. When May came in at 6 and found her at the table, May looked at her for a moment and then went to the stove without comment and started breakfast, which was its own kind of steadiness, the kind that doesn't announce itself. The courtroom was fuller than Wednesday. Word had spread, the way word spreads in territory where people live far enough apart that news travels slowly, but lands hard when it arrives. There were faces she hadn't seen before, ranchers from further out, a woman she didn't know who was sitting in the front bench with her hands folded in her lap and an expression that said she had traveled some distance and intended to hear everything. Two men she'd later learn were from the territorial governor's office, sent to observe after someone in Cheyenne had read the preservation order and made some calls. Voss was already at his table when she came in. He looked at her the way he had on Wednesday, assessing, and this time she saw something additional in it. Not respect exactly, but a recalibration. She'd held up better under cross-examination than he'd planned for. He knew it. She knew he knew it. They both sat down and waited for the judge. Pemberton leaned close and said quietly, "He's going to go after the conflict of interest angle hard today. Your employment relationship with Ashcroft, the personal living arrangement. He'll try to make it look like you manufactured this to benefit him." "I know. If he gets too personal, I'll object, but some of it the judge will allow." "I know that too." Pemberton looked at her for a moment. "Are you ready?" "I've been ready for 2 weeks," she said. "I've just been waiting for the room." He almost smiled. Barely, but she caught it. Judge Crane came in. The room stood, sat, settled. The morning session went the way she'd expected. Pemberton entered the full documentary record, all 17 archive surveys, all 12 comparison analyses, the accumulated correspondence from Sutter, Briggs, and Morrison, plus a fourth rancher named Aldous Webb, who had sent a letter Friday afternoon after reading about the case in the territorial paper, describing a boundary adjustment on his south fence that matched the pattern exactly and added an 8th year to the timeline. 8 years. Meridian Holdings had been operating this scheme for 8 years, and the local land office had processed every fraudulent filing without, apparently, a single person raising a flag. Or with one person raising no flags because that person was the scheme. The land office administrator, a man named Gerald Pitts, who had held the position for 9 years, was in the courtroom. He had been required to appear by the preservation order. He sat in the gallery with the expression of a man who has decided that absolute stillness is his best current strategy. Elena watched him the way you watch something you've been thinking about for weeks. When Pemberton called her to the stand for the second time, she went through the documentary evidence with the same systematic clarity she'd used Wednesday, this time adding Webb's parcel to the analysis and walking the court through what 8 years of consistent pattern looked like when you put it all on one chart. She had redrawn the chart over the weekend to accommodate the additional data. It was cleaner than the first version. She'd learned from how the judge had looked at the first one what he needed to see. Then Voss stood up. He came at the conflict of interest the way she'd expected. Her employment with Ashcroft, the fact that she lived at the ranch, the fact that the primary benefit of the case accrued to her employer. "You live in Mr. Ashcroft's home," he said. "I have a room at the Ashcroft Ranch while I complete an extended accounting project. Yes. And Mr. Ashcroft provides your income. He pays me for accounting services at an agreed rate. Yes. So you have a direct financial interest in the outcome of this case." "I have an interest in accurate land records," she said, "which is also what the territorial law requires. My financial interest in the outcome is the same as any other resident of this territory who owns or works land. I have an interest in the land office being honest." She paused. "If that disqualifies me, it disqualifies everyone who's been harmed by 8 years of fraud." Voss moved on. He questioned whether a person without surveying credentials could reliably interpret survey documents. "The survey documents interpret themselves," she said. "I compared numbers in 2 sets of records. The numbers are different. I didn't need credentials to see that. I needed arithmetic." He came at her personal history. The estrangement from her family, the circumstances under which she'd come to work for Ashcroft. "You were cast out of your family home," he said. It was stated flatly, like a fact being dropped on a table. The implication was in the flatness, not the words. "I left my family home in November," she said. She kept her voice level. She had practiced this part specifically, not in front of a mirror, which would have felt absurd, but in her mind running it over and over until the words had lost their power to make her hands unsteady. "I established my own residence. I subsequently took employment. Those are the facts. Under difficult circumstances. Yes, Under difficult circumstances, I found work that I was qualified for, and in the course of doing that work, I found evidence of systematic fraud. The circumstances under which I found the evidence don't change what the evidence shows. She heard something from the benches behind her. Not a sound exactly, but the sense of the room shifting slightly, leaning. She didn't look back. Voss had one more angle. He tried it. Miss Cross, isn't it possible that what you've identified as fraudulent alterations are in fact the result of survey methodology differences between the original territorial surveyors and the surveyors employed by Meridian Holdings when they conducted their own boundary assessments prior to purchase? It was the best question he'd asked. She'd anticipated it, and had almost hoped he wouldn't use it because it was the one that required the most careful answer. If that were the case, she said, we would expect to see the Meridian surveys on record as separate documents, filed at the time of purchase, identifying the methodology difference and the resulting boundary interpretation. No such documents exist in the territorial record. What exists is the original survey, and then a local land office filing that uses the same survey reference number as the original, but with different boundary figures. The reference number is the same. The filing claims to be the same document. It isn't. She looked at Voss steadily. You can't have a methodology difference and claim it's the same survey. Those are mutually exclusive. Voss sat down. It was not a dramatic moment. There was no outburst from the gallery, no visible reaction from the judge. The courtroom simply continued being a courtroom, the way truth continues being truth, without requiring an audience's acknowledgement to stay what it is. Gerald Pitts was called to the stand in the afternoon. Pemberton examined him for 40 minutes. Pitts was evasive in the way of someone who has constructed evasions in advance and is sticking to them regardless of how inadequate they sound. Clerical errors, staff turnover, the difficulty of maintaining consistent records across multiple survey systems, the possibility that the archive documents themselves might contain errors introduced during the filing process. Every answer moved the responsibility somewhere else. Every answer assumed the judge couldn't read a number. When Pemberton produced the personnel records showing that Pitts had personally authorized each of the 12 disputed filings, his signature on the processing confirmation for each one, a fact Elena had found in a file she'd requested through Pemberton 2 days after the initial hearing, Pitts stopped speaking for a long moment that felt longer than it was. Mr. Pitts, Judge Crane said, from the bench, in the tone of a man who has been patient and is indicating that the patience has reached its limit. Your signature appears on 12 processing confirmations for filings that contain boundary descriptions inconsistent with the original archive surveys. Can you explain that inconsistency? Pitt's attorney, a local man who had the look of someone who had not anticipated the morning going this direction, leaned over and spoke quietly in his ear. Pitt said, I'd like to exercise my right to decline to answer on grounds that my answer might incriminate me. The room absorbed that. Judge Crane wrote something down. He did not look surprised. The ruling came the following Thursday. Pemberton brought it to the ranch in person, which told her something before he opened his mouth, because Pemberton was not a man who made unnecessary trips. He sat at the table where she'd spent months working through documents and read the relevant sections aloud in his precise, unornamented way. The court found in favor of the plaintiff on all 12 parcels. The fraudulent boundary alterations were voided. The original survey designations were reinstated as the legal record. Meridian Holdings was ordered to remove any fencing or structures placed on land that reverted to its original owners under the ruling. The Territorial Attorney General's office was formally referred the matter of Gerald Pitts and any co-conspirators for criminal investigation based on the evidence presented. The court further noted that the 4 additional ranchers, Sutter, Briggs, Morrison, and Webb, had standing to file individual claims based on the established pattern, and indicated those claims would be expedited given the existing evidentiary record. Pemberton set the document down. The Ashcroft Ranch's northeast boundary is restored, he said. The North Corridor grazing land is yours. Gideon nodded once. He was looking at the table. The criminal referral means Pitts is likely to cooperate with the Attorney General's investigation to reduce his own exposure, Pemberton continued, which means we'll eventually find out who at Meridian Holdings directed the scheme and what other arrangements may have existed between Meridian and other officials. He paused. This case is the beginning of something larger. You should know that. There will likely be more hearings, more testimony requested. I'll be available, Elena said. Pemberton picked up his document. I've been practicing law for 30 years, he said, without looking at her, in the tone of a man stating something he considers factual rather than kind. I have worked with analysts, researchers, and expert witnesses of various credentials. The documentary case you built was as thorough and as clearly presented as anything I've put in front of a court. He stood. You might consider what you want to do with that. He shook Gideon's hand, shook hers, and left. The kitchen was quiet except for Clara, who was on the floor on a folded blanket May had put down, working on the project of learning to roll over, which she had been attempting with focused determination for 3 days and had not yet accomplished. She pushed up on her arms, made a sound of intense effort, and fell back flat. She lay there for a moment as if reconsidering her approach. Elena watched her daughter and felt something loosen in her chest, something that had been wound tight since November, since before November, since the long years of being the capable daughter in a family that needed her capability but could not quite bring itself to acknowledge it. It didn't come loose all at once. That would have been too clean, too much like the ending of a story. It just eased, slightly. Enough. Raymond Cross came to the Ashcroft Ranch on a Tuesday in early May. She saw him from the window before he knocked, recognized the shape of him on horseback, the particular set of his shoulders that she'd known her entire life, and felt the old reflex, the bracing, the preparation, the internal gathering of whatever she was going to need for whatever this was. She went to the door and opened it before he reached the porch. He stopped a few feet away. He had aged since November, not dramatically, but measurably. His beard was longer and grayer, and he hadn't trimmed it with his usual care. He held his hat in both hands, which was the same thing he'd done at funerals when she was young, the only time she'd ever seen him hold his hat that way. Elena, he said. Papa. He looked at her. He looked past her into the house, which she understood was him looking for Clara. She stepped aside. He came in. Clara was on the floor with her blanket. She had, in the past week, finally mastered the role and was now engaged in the subsequent project of objecting to being placed on her back when she clearly preferred her stomach. She was on her stomach when Raymond saw her, arms working, head up, looking at the world from her new vantage point with the dark-eyed intensity that Elena had come to recognize as her daughter's fundamental orientation toward existence. Raymond Cross stood in the doorway of the kitchen and looked at his granddaughter and said nothing for a long time. "She's got your mother's hairline," he said finally. His voice was rough in a way that wasn't anger. "I know," Elena said. He was quiet again. She waited him out the way she'd learned to wait people out, though waiting her father out carried a different weight than waiting anyone else. "I heard about the court case," he said. "Most people have. Ed Sutter came to see me last week. He said—" Raymond stopped. He looked at his hat. "He said you'd been trying to get those boundary records looked at for years and nobody listened. He said you were the one who found it." He looked up. "All of it. I found it in accounting records I was working through. It needed to be addressed." Elena. He said her name the way he almost never said it, not as the beginning of a sentence, not as the precursor to a direction or a judgment, just her name, standing alone. "I handled things wrong. In November, He stopped again. "I was wrong." She looked at her father. She saw him the way she had not let herself see him since November. Not as the immovable fact of him, not as the wall she'd spent 23 years navigating, but as a man in his 60s holding his hat in both hands, who had made a mistake of the kind that can't be called back and had been living with it. She didn't tell him it was fine. It wasn't fine. She didn't perform forgiveness she hadn't finished arriving at. She wasn't there yet, and she wasn't going to pretend she was because it would have been easier for both of them in this moment. "I know you were," she said. He nodded. It was the nod of a man accepting something he knew he deserved. "There's the north pasture," he said. "The 40 acres along the creek. Your mother always said it should have been yours anyway. She said it in her will. You were too young at the time, and He stopped. "I should have transferred it to you when you turned 18. I didn't. I'd like to do it now. No conditions." She looked at him for a moment. "The north pasture is good land. It's the best 40 on the property. You know it is." She did know it. She'd walked it as a girl with her mother, who had told her the name of every plant that grew along the creek bank and had known them all, everyone. She had not let herself think about that land since November. "I'll have Pemberton draw up the transfer documents," she said. Raymond nodded again. He looked back at Clara, who had rolled over onto her back and was now examining her own hand with the focused suspicion of someone encountering it for the first time. "Can I—" He gestured toward the floor. "She doesn't perform on demand," Elena said. "She'll decide if she wants your attention." He sat down on the floor, slowly, with the care of a man whose knees had been giving him trouble for years. He sat on the floor of Gideon Ashcroft's kitchen, a few feet from his granddaughter, and waited. Clara looked at him. She looked at the ceiling. She looked at him again. Then she reached in his direction with one fist, not quite toward him, but close enough to count as an acknowledgement. Raymond Cross put one large, weathered hand near hers on the floor, not grabbing, just present, and she grabbed his index finger with her whole small fist and held it. Elena watched them from the doorway and didn't say anything. Some things take longer to repair than others, and some things that break badly can only be rebuilt from the ground up, slower and more carefully than the original. And what you get at the end is not the same as what you had before. It's different. Sometimes different is enough. "What?" Gideon asked her on a Saturday evening in June. Not in the way of a formal occasion, not with the stagecraft that some men brought to such moments. They were on the porch after supper. May had gone in. Clara was asleep. The evening light doing the thing it does in June on the Wyoming high plain, going gold and then orange and lasting longer than seems reasonable. The sky holding on to it as if reluctant. He'd been quiet for a while. She'd been content with the quiet, which was one of the things she'd learned about herself over the past months. She was done, for the foreseeable future, with silence that required interpretation. The quiet on this porch didn't require anything. It was just two people sitting in the same evening. "I want to ask you something," he said. She looked at him. "I'm not asking you because you need somewhere to be. You've got 40 acres along the Cross Ranch Creek, and Pemberton's already talking about other ranchers who want to hire you for accounting review. So you've got income, and you've built enough of a reputation now that you've got options." He was looking at the valley while he said this, which she recognized as him being careful, saying the important things in the right order before he got to the thing he actually wanted to say. "I'm asking because the last 8 months, working alongside you through all of it, I've learned what kind of person you are, and He stopped, started again. "I don't want to run this ranch without you in it." He turned and looked at her. "I'm asking you to marry me," he said, "as a partner in everything, the ranch, the accounts, the decisions, the whole of it. Equal. That's what I mean when I say it." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about November, the cold porch, the worn satchel, the walk into the dark. She thought about the cabin, the hatchet, the 4 matches. She thought about the sack on the birch tree and the 6 pages she'd set on a hay bale in a barn, and the courtroom, and Pitts taking the 5th, and the ruling that had come back clean. She thought about Clara learning to roll over and Raymond sitting on a kitchen floor holding a finger in a small fist. She had not needed rescuing. That was the thing she'd known since the beginning and had proved over and over to herself and to anyone else paying attention. She had not needed this man to save her from anything. What she had found instead was something rarer. Someone who had seen her working and had gotten out of the way and helped when asked and had not once required her to be smaller than she was. That was not a small thing. That was, in her experience, an almost singular thing. "Equal," she said. "You mean that. I've watched you walk into a territorial courtroom and dismantle 8 years of organized fraud with a chart you drew by hand," he said. "I'm not under any confusion about who I'm talking to." She almost smiled. The chart was very good. It was an excellent chart. She looked out at the valley. The light was nearly gone now, the gold thinning into the blue-gray of early dark, the first stars becoming visible over the eastern ridge, the ridge where the cabin was. She could not see it from here, but she knew exactly where it sat in the dark. And she knew the door that now latched properly, and the fireplace that drew right when you pushed the damper left and up, and the sleeping platform that was too narrow, and the shelf where her mother's thimble sat next to a jar of preserves she'd made in March. She would keep the cabin. That had already decided itself somewhere in the back of her mind. She would keep it not because she needed it, but because it was the first thing she had ever built entirely on her own terms. And you don't give those things up. Yes, she said. He nodded. He didn't reach for her hand or say anything further, which was exactly right. He had learned over 8 months the precise amount of space she needed, and he maintained it without being told. She appreciated that more than she could have explained to anyone who hadn't spent years in rooms where the space was never right. They sat on the porch until the dark was complete and the stars were out fully over the valley, and then they went inside. The wedding was small. She had not wanted large. May cried, which surprised Elena less than it might have once. Bert Calloway came, which surprised her somewhat. Ed Sutter came with his wife. Cal Briggs came alone. Hank Morrison sent a letter because he couldn't make the travel. Arthur Pemberton sent a note that was 3 sentences and contained no sentiment whatsoever, but was, she understood, his version of warmth. Raymond Cross came. He stood in the back and he watched his daughter marry a man who treated her as an equal, and he did not speak much, and he left early, and Elena let him do all of that without comment because some reconciliations happen in gestures rather than conversations, and you have to let them take the shape they can take rather than the shape you wish they would. Dale came too, which she hadn't expected. He stood next to their father and said nothing during the ceremony, and found her afterward and said quietly, "I should have said something in November." He looked at the floor. "I know." "Yes," she said, "you should have." He nodded. That was all. She didn't tell him it didn't matter, because it had mattered. But she shook his hand, which was its own kind of statement about what was possible going forward. Clara wore the blue flannel blanket over her dress, because May had made her a small dress from the same fabric, and Clara had made her opinion of other options clear. She spent the ceremony being passed between May and Ed Sutter's wife, and a woman named Ruth who ran the town's dry goods, and had appointed herself Clara's honorary grandmother sometime in April without formally announcing the appointment. Clara tolerated all of it with the particular expression she wore when she was managing her circumstances, slightly skeptical, fundamentally self-possessed, ready to register a complaint if the situation warranted it. She was 8 months old and already the most opinionated person in any room she entered. Elena watched her daughter from across the small, crowded space and felt the full weight of the past 8 months. Not as something to put down, not as something to escape, but as the substance of what had been built. Every piece of it. The cold and the hunger and the fear and the work and the discovery and the courtroom and the arguments and the grief over her mother and the complicated, unfinished grief over her father and the surprising, solid thing that had grown in the space between herself and the man now standing beside her. All of it was real, and all of it was hers. The territory had tried to erase her. Winter had tried. Poverty had tried. Men with money and lawyers and the administrative machinery of the Territorial Land Office had tried, more recently and more deliberately. What they had made instead, without intending to, was a woman who knew exactly what she was capable of because she'd had to find out under conditions that didn't allow for uncertainty. You don't get that knowledge any other way. Elena understood this about it. The cabin in the dark, the 4 matches, the walk through the snow with a sick baby. Those weren't things she would have chosen, but they were the things that had told her in the most unambiguous terms possible what she was made of. She was made of something that held. Later, after the small celebration had ended and the house had gone quiet and Clara was asleep and Gideon was in the barn doing the last check of the evening. The way he did every night. Regardless of what the day had contained, Elena stood at the window of what was now her home and looked out at the dark shape of the valley and the darker shape of the ridge where the cabin sat. She thought about her mother, who had carried a silver thimble across 3 states in a wagon, and had planted things along a creek bank, and had known the name of every plant that grew there. She thought about what her mother had wanted for her, which was not safety exactly, not ease, not the absence of difficulty, but this kind of standing, this particular posture of a person who knows where she is and how she got there and what it cost. The thimble was on the shelf in the cabin. She'd left it there deliberately. Some things mark a place the way a post marks a fence line, not to contain, but to say, here. Here's where something real happened. Here is where the ground begins. The valley was dark and enormous and indifferent, the way wild country is indifferent, making no promises, offering no guarantees, requiring everything you have, and returning only what you can build. Elena Cross. Elena Ashcroft. Now, though she kept both names because she'd earned both in different ways, at different costs, stood at the window and looked out at what she had survived and what she had built and what she had chosen, and she was not finished. She knew that. Tomorrow would bring accounts to manage and land to work, and a daughter to raise, and a fraud investigation still grinding forward through the territorial courts, and her father's complicated love to navigate and her husband's quiet steadiness to trust, and her own restless intelligence to aim at something. She was not finished. She had never been the kind of person who was finished. But here, tonight, in the house she'd made her own through work and grief and determination, with her daughter asleep and the valley dark and the stars doing what they'd always done, regardless of what happened beneath them, here she was, at least, fully herself. That was what the wilderness had given her, in the end. Not rescue, not ease, not the life she would have chosen if choosing had been on offer. Just this, the knowledge of who she was. That, she had learned, was the only thing nobody could take.